In this video I'm going to rebuild my entire Neovim configuration from scratch. By the end we'll have a config that has most of the features you will find in a modern IDE like VS Code. We'll have a beautiful file tree, syntax highlighting, LSP integration with autocompletion, a sleek status line and buffer line, a fuzzy finder, Git integration and so much more. We'll base our config on a project called Kickstart.nvim. Kickstart is a minimal template that is designed to be a starting point for one's own configuration. We'll borrow a lot of code from it to quickly get set up and running. If you're looking for a deep dive into how all of these components like LSP work, this video might not be for you. Here we're going to take a more pragmatic approach to build a custom config quickly and outsource the heavy lifting to the amazing maintainers of Kickstart. There are other projects like LazyVim, AstroVim and NVChat that offer a full configuration out of the box. I think they're absolutely fantastic, but for my personal taste, they do a bit too much. I feel like learning someone else's workflow rather than creating my own. For me personally, Kickstart strikes the perfect balance here. It is minimal, but all the hard stuff has been solved. So let's get started. Alright, the first thing we want to do is make sure that we have Neovim installed. So if you type nvim --version, you should see the version of Neovim. I'm running on 0.10.1. Now if you don't have Neovim installed yet, you can go to the Neovim GitHub repository and find the installation instructions for your operating system here. Since I'm on Mac, I installed it with Homebrew. Now that we have Neovim installed, let's briefly talk about how to configure it in general. Let's go back to the terminal. We can open Neovim with the nvim command, but currently it looks pretty boring and basic. To customize it, let's exit out and create the config directory. Neovim's configuration lives in the .config/nvim directory. We've just created this one. Let's cd into it. And here we need to create an init.lua file. Now let's open this file with Neovim. This file is loaded every time Neovim is started. So any options or configurations that we want to change go here. For example, if we wanted to enable line numbers, we could change that here with vim wo number and set this value to true. Now if we save and quit and go back into Neovim, you can see that now actually we have line numbers. Now the fact that Neovim uses Lua as a configuration language seemed a bit intimidating to me at first, but actually it turns out that Lua is an incredibly simple language. I believe if you know any other programming language, you can pick up enough Lua in less than 30 minutes. A good resource for this is learnxandyminutes.com/docs/Lua. This is a really concise guide that teaches you how variables work, how if statements work, loops, classes, functions, and basically everything that you need. I would encourage you to read through this. It really takes less than 30 minutes and you'll know more than enough Lua to configure Neovim. Now back to the terminal. Since Lua is a programming language, it means that we can use programming concepts like variables, functions and loops, and of course we can also import other files. This allows us to make our config incredibly modular. Let me show you an example. Let's remove our option here and replace it with an import require options. Save and quit. And now let's create this file and move our option there. If we want to import files in our init file, we need to place them in a Lua folder. So let's create this one. Let's cd into that folder. And here we can create the options.lua file. Let's open this file up in Neovim. Here we can paste our option. Let's get rid of the empty lines. Save and quit. And now if we open Neovim up again, we can see that we still have the line number. Of course, this was just an incredibly simple example, but I hope it helped to illustrate a bit how the basics work. Now let's take your config to the next level by having a look at Kickstart. First, let's remove again the config that we have so far. So I cd two directories up and I remove the nvim directory. Clear the terminal, and now let's have a look at the Kickstart GitHub repo. If we scroll down a bit in the README, you can see that Kickstart is not meant to be a Neovim distribution. It's not fully featured. It's meant to be a starting point for your own configuration, which is exactly what I like about it. If we scroll down a bit further, you can find the clone instructions. Let's click on Linux and Mac and copy this command. Now we can go back to the terminal and run this command. This essentially cloned the whole repository into the .config/nvim directory. So now you can see that we have an nvim directory again, and if we cd into it, we have the whole repository here. Kickstart has a lot of plugins that provide additional functionalities. If we now open Neovim again, all of these plugins will be installed and all the configuration options will be applied. So let's do that now. Okay, a lot of things happened here. I think the most obvious change is that the color theme has changed, which is also coming from a plugin. And the window we are looking at right now is the UI of Lazy. Lazy is a Neovim plugin manager that allows us to manage the plugins in our configuration. So here we can see all the plugins that got installed. For now, let's just exit out of it by pressing Q. And have a look at the init.lua file from Kickstart. Our Neovim configuration already looks so much nicer. We have a nice status line, we have a nice color theme, and a lot of other things. This file has almost 1,000 lines, and almost all of the configuration lives inside of this file. If you want to learn more about how configuration in Neovim works in general, I would highly encourage you to read through all of these comments. They're extremely concise and well written, and it taught me personally a lot about how the configuration works. Now let me demonstrate the simplest way to work with this configuration. What you could do is go to the bottom and scroll up a bit. Not so much, to line about 921. And here, if you for example want to have a file tree plugin, you could uncomment neotree and save and quit and go back. Now it will install neotree. Press Q again to close the lazy window. And now if we press backspace, you can open the neotree file tree, which is nice. At the root, of course, we have the init file that we're looking at right now, and then we have this Lua directory. Inside of this directory, we have a custom directory with plugins, and then we have the Kickstart directory that also has plugins. So these plugins you see here inside of the Kickstart directory are the same plugins that you can uncomment here. So they're kind of pre-configured but optional. Then inside of this custom plugins directory, you can add your own plugins, and if you want to import those, you can uncomment this line right here, 928. So like this, Kickstart keeps your own configuration separate from the main config and avoids any merge conflicts in the future. Now you could do this, and this is probably the easiest way, but personally I prefer to start my own config completely from scratch and only take from Kickstart exactly what I need and nothing more. So while this is really nice, let's actually exit out of here and go one folder up and remove the whole Neovim configuration again. And now let's go back to the browser, scroll up in the Kickstart repository, copy the URL, go back to the terminal. Now let's go to my Git directory and git clone the Kickstart repo here. Now I'll go into that directory. And now we have a local copy of the Kickstart repo that we can use as a reference to copy from. Now this step is not strictly necessary. You could also keep your browser open and reference the Kickstart config from there. But I prefer to open the Kickstart config inside the terminal and reference it from there. To open it inside the terminal, I have a regular Vim backup config that also has some syntax highlighting and basic features. And I can use that one while we're building the Neovim configuration. If you want to follow along with the Vim backup config, you can find it inside of my .files repository. If you scroll to Vim, and there you can find a Vim RC file. Pretty simple file, it doesn't rely on any plugins, it's just basic configuration. It's also not very long. If you want to use this one, you can copy it from here, and then you need to create a .vimrc file inside of your home directory and paste all of this code there. Also, of course, you can just use regular vanilla Vim without any configuration whatsoever. This will also work. Alright, now let's go back into the terminal and open the init.lua file with regular Vim. So now I just want to keep this open here as a reference. As I mentioned, you can also just keep it inside the browser. That's also completely fine. And I want to create a new terminal window. You can open a second terminal window, or you can create another tab inside of your terminal. Or if you, like me, have Tmux configured and installed, you can also open another window inside of Tmux. So let me do that now with the shortcut prefix C. Now we have a second window. If you're confused by what just happened, Tmux is basically the bar that you see at the bottom. It's just one way to manage windows inside of the terminal, and I can easily switch between those windows. But as I mentioned, this is not necessary. You can also just open a second terminal window. That's also completely fine. For clarity, I'll rename this window to nvim config and the first window to kickstart. All right, let's go back to nvim config. And let's cd back into the home directory. Let's go into config and let's create again from scratch our nvim directory. Let's go into it. Small typo. Clear the terminal and start a fresh config by creating the init.lua file. Clear again and open this file in Neovim. Now, how do we start creating our own config from scratch using Kickstart? The first thing I would like to do is set up a color theme and a file tree. This will allow us to more easily see exactly what is going on. To install these plugins, we first need to install a plugin manager. And we've already seen that one has been installed in Kickstart. So let's check out the Kickstart configuration and see if we can borrow some of the code. Let's go back into the Kickstart config. Here, since we know that the plugin manager is called lazy, let's search for the word lazy. And here we have the code that sets up the lazy plugin manager. And it's actually really nicely explained as well. We have a comment here saying that this is the plugin manager, where it comes from, this is the setup code, and then some more instructions and explanations. And here we have the code that sets up all the different plugins. Again, I would really encourage you to read through the comments. It's really nicely explained and you will understand a lot. For now, let's copy until this line, go back into our own config and paste it here from the plus register. All right, I like to get rid of these comments. Let's remove them. Also this one. Okay, and let's close the setup call. The way this works is that the code snippet here at the beginning installs the plugin manager itself, and then the setup method is called, which sets up and installs all the plugins we put in here. So let's do this for Neotree, which is the plugin that gives us a nice file tree. So here we are at Neotree's GitHub repository, and if we scroll down a bit, we do actually have a nice code snippet to install Neotree with lazy. So let's copy this one, go back into our Neovim configuration and simply paste it here. All right, let's save this to see if it worked. Now if we open up Neovim again, we'll see that everything will be installed. So again, we see the UI of lazy, and here we can see the different packages that got installed. Neotree had some dependencies as well. And just to show you a bit the UI, we can see at the top the different tabs that we can go into by typing the key that is next to the respective tab. So H takes us to lazy, I takes us to install, U to update, and so on. And if we're not sure what to do, we can press question mark, and this will offer an explanation of exactly what we can do with lazy. So now, since everything has been installed correctly, let's press Q to exit out of the lazy UI. And now if we want to open Neotree, which we have just installed, we can go into command mode and type Neotree to open the file tree. And here we want to create the config structure. As we've already seen, the different modules that we want to import in our init.lua file need to be inside of the Lua directory. So let's create this directory. In Neotree, we can create a new directory by pressing A, and then it will ask for the name of the directory. So in this case, it's Lua, and we need to end with a / to indicate that it's the directory. Inside of this directory, I want to create two more directories. I want to create one for plugins and another one called core. Inside of core, I like to keep my most fundamental Vim configurations, like Vim Options and Keymaps. So let's create those files. Focusing again on core, I press A again and create the keymaps.lua file. And then I go back to highlight core and then press A. And I create another file called options. Let's take care of those in a bit. And for now, let's just import them in our main init file. To switch again to the file, I press Ctrl W and then L. This will move to the right. And here I type require, and I require from core the options module, and of course also the core.keymaps, even though we haven't any defined yet. Before going into the options and keymaps, let's add a nicer color theme. Personally, I really like the Nord color theme, which is one of my favorites. You can find the configuration here on this GitHub. And unfortunately, this one does not provide a config that we can directly copy for lazy, but I think this is a good opportunity to introduce you to some of the additional features that lazy has to offer. Let's copy the name of the repo here, go back into our terminal, and now let's add this plugin below our Neotree setup. Here I create another Lua table, and I paste the name of the repo. Lazy, as the name suggests, has the possibility of lazy loading plugins, which is super useful, but since this is a color theme, I want to see it all the time and I really want to make sure that this option is disabled. So we can simply do this by typing lazy equals false. Also, we can assign a priority to this plugin, and I set it to 1000, which is a really high value. This will make sure that the color theme is loaded before all other plugins. Now if we go back to the repository, we can see that there are some options that can be configured for Nord. And also we need to run this set method in order to load the color theme. So how do we do this? Let's copy this and go back into our terminal in the init file. Let's center this And now let's add the config property. And this property takes a function which is executed when the plugin is loaded. So let's create this function and this function. And now let's paste the configuration options here. Let's maybe add some indentation. I don't worry too much about formatting right now, because anyways we're going to rearrange some things pretty soon. And also we're going to install an auto formatter which will take care of formatting automatically. Alright, for now I don't want to change these options. Let's just write and quit and reopen Neovim. Now we can see Node is getting installed and the color theme was immediately applied. Let's press Q again to close the lazy UI. And this is something I can work with much better. Next, let's configure some Vim options to get a better experience with the editor. So I want to open up Neotree again by going into command mode and typing Neotree. From here I can go into Lua, Core, and open the options module that we just created. Now let's add a few options here and go through them one by one. First, I would always like to see line numbers, which we currently don't have. Actually, not just line numbers, but relative line numbers. If you're not familiar with relative line numbers, this is a feature that a lot of people activate in Neovim because it makes navigation much easier in Vim. Let me just quickly activate them manually. So, okay, now you can see it very well because we only have 2 lines, but let me add a few more. So now you can see that always the line that my cursor is on will show a 0, and then we can see the lines relative to that line. Above my cursor we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and below we have 1, 2, 3, 4. That makes it very easy to jump to a specific line. Now if I want to jump 3 lines up, I can just say 3J and it will jump 3 lines up. So a pretty useful feature. Next, let's sync the clipboard from Vim with the OS clipboard. So whatever we yank in Vim will be available in our OS clipboard as well. Also, I want to set line wrap and line break. Wrap will allow us to have very long lines even outside the visible display of Vim. And line break goes hand in hand with this. This will prevent breaking lines in the middle of the word. Next, I like to enable mouse mode. And yeah, this might be a bit of a faux pas in Vim, but I still like to do it because this allows you to click and highlight things in Vim. And I find this a bit easier when screen sharing at work because I feel that it helps people follow along more easily. Now let's add the auto indent option and set it to true. This will maintain the current indentation level whenever you start a new line. Ignore case and smart case are also 2 options that kind of go hand in hand. This will basically make searching inside of your Vim buffer case insensitive. Unless you include capital letters, then those will be respected. Now let's also add some options to improve our indentation. These 4 options go hand in hand. Basically it means that instead of tabs we prefer spaces, and 1 tab represents 4 spaces. I do have quite a few more options that you can see now. I commented each one of them and you can find a link to my configuration in the description box down below. Feel free to go through them in your own time. I try to add a descriptive comment to each one of these options. For now, let's save and quit and reopen Neovim. So now as you can see, the relative line numbers are enabled by default. And if I start, for example, a new line below an indented line, the indentation will continue. Now let's open Neotree back up and start adding a few keymaps. So let's open the keymaps file and set space as our leader key. Now with space being our leader key, we also want to disable any default behavior that was attached to it in visual and normal mode. And we can do this by adding the following line. Next, let's define a variable for conciseness called opts, and this will set the no remap option to true and silent to true. No remap means that mappings should not be redefined, and silent means that commands should not be shown in the command line. Now the next keymap allows us to save a file with Ctrl S, which I find a bit more intuitive. Now you might start to notice a pattern of how these keymaps are defined. Essentially, we are always going to say vim.keymap.set, and then the first argument is going to be the mode in which the keymap is going to be applied, followed by the keymap itself, in this case Ctrl S, and control is going to be abbreviated with C here. Then the command that is going to be executed. So in this case, command means that we will be in command mode, then space, a W, and then CR stands for enter. And lastly, we have some options. The options are always pretty much going to be the same, so that's why we defined a variable to make it a bit more concise. The next keymap allows us to also save a file, but it allows us to save a file without formatting. Later we will set up some auto formatters that automatically format our files when we save it. In some cases we might want to avoid this, and for this purpose we have the leader SN keymap to save a file without formatting. Similar to Ctrl S, I like to be able to quit a file with Ctrl Q, so I add another keymap for this. The next keymap changes the default behavior of the X key. As you might know, the X key in Vim deletes the character under the cursor. The problem with this is that by default, it will replace whatever is in your default register. So next time you paste something, you will paste whatever was under the cursor when you executed X last time. This is not the way I personally like to use X. When I press X, I just want the character gone and I don't want to copy it necessarily. The next two keymaps I stole from the Primogens config, and I found these are pretty neat. What they do is basically when you do a vertical scroll using Command D and Command U, or you search for something and then jump to the next occurrence of whatever you searched for with N or capital N to jump back, then they will execute that command and append it with a ZZ. This keeps the cursor in the center of the screen, which is a bit more easy to follow. The next set of options allows us to resize Vim splits using the arrow keys. I'll demonstrate how that works in a bit. Let's also add some more options to navigate buffers more easily. So with these keymaps we can use the tab and shift tab to navigate forwards and backwards between files. If we want to close a buffer, we can use space X or leader X, and to open up a new buffer or file, you can do that with leader B. Now let's also add a few options for better window management. With these options we can create a vertical split with leader V, a horizontal split with leader H. If we have two splits and we want to make them equal size, we can do that with leader SE, and we can close splits with leader XS. Also, navigating splits is a bit painful in Vim by default. So now, for example, if I want to navigate to the Neo tree split, I have to press Ctrl W and then H to go to the left, or Ctrl W L to go to the right, which is a bit cumbersome. I think it's much easier to just press Ctrl and then the Vim keys where you want to go. And so this is what these options are for. The next keymaps are for managing tabs, and by tabs here I mean actual Vim tabs and not buffers. So with leader TO we can create a new tab, leader TX closes a tab, leader TN goes to the next tab, and leader TP goes to the previous tab. Let's center this again and add the next set of keymaps. This toggles line wrapping, so that means if we have a very long line and it could be outside of the visual field of the Vim window, then we can press leader LW for line wrap to wrap the line and make everything visible inside of this current window. The next keymap improves indenting. So in Vim you can easily indent lines by selecting them in visual mode and pressing the greater than key. The problem is that once you do that, you are back in normal mode and you don't stay in visual mode. And this is what this keymap prevents. You will stay inside visual mode and can indent as many levels as you like. The next keymap is similar to what we've done to the X key. So what this does is when we yank something, then we highlight something else and press P to paste over it, then whatever we pasted over will replace what we've last yanked. And this keymap serves to prevent that behavior and keep what you've last yanked. Finally, the last set of keymaps allows us to navigate diagnostics more efficiently. If you don't know what diagnostics are, basically when you have an issue in your code, the LSP can detect many of those and show this directly in the line where the issue is. With these keymaps, you can easily jump between those diagnostics. And you can also see all the diagnostics in a list by pressing leader Q here, for example. And then with the opening and closing bracket and D, we can jump forwards and backwards between the diagnostics. Those are all the keymaps that I wanted to set. Let's save and quit, go back again. Let's open Neovim one more time. Now to demonstrate some of these keymaps, let's open up a new split with leader V, and we can resize this split with the arrow keys. If I want to have equally sized splits again, I can press leader SE. I can also create a horizontal split with leader H, and I can easily navigate between those splits using the HJKL and Control. Now let's close the horizontal split with leader XS and the vertical split with leader XS again. Now that we have the basic structure, options and keymaps set up, let's have a look again at the plugins. I want to keep this config quite modular, so I don't really like having all the different plugins and configurations inside this main init.lua file. What I want to do instead is create a module for each of these plugins and then import them in this init.lua file. Let's do that with a color theme, for example. So again, let's open Neotree. Go into our plugins directory that we already created and create a module for color theme .lua, and here we want to create our Node color theme. So let's actually delete it from here, save this file, open the color theme file and paste our color theme configuration here. Now since this plugin configuration now lives in a different file and we want to import it into our init.lua file, we need to return it from this file. And let's also add a bit of indentation to make it a bit more readable. So now let's go back into our init.lua file, and here we can say require plugins.colortheme. Let's save this exit out of Vim, go back inside of Vim, and we can see that it still works. So it's quite nice. It's a lot more modular this way. Alright, there's one more thing that I would like to change in the color theme. So let's go into command mode, E, Lua, plugins, color theme. Here I would like to make the following change. I want to set the disable background option to true. This will disable the background color and make it transparent so that the background image of my terminal can shine through, which is something that I really like aesthetically. But in certain situations, this can make your code a little bit less legible. So what I like to do is have the option to toggle the setting on and off whenever I like. I wrote a small snippet for this one, which basically defines a variable bg transparent, which is true by default. So by default, the transparency should be enabled. And then we have a small function. This function will invert the variable and then set the not disable background option to that variable and then apply the color theme again. So this way, whenever this function is executed, the background will be toggled on and off. And now I define a keymap, leader bg, and assign this keymap to the toggle transparency function. So whenever I type leader bg, this function will be executed and the background will be toggled on and off. Note that I didn't define this keymap in the Keymaps module, and this is because this keymap is plugin specific, and in the Keymaps module I only want to have general keymaps that don't apply to a specific plugin. So let's save this, quit, and open Neovim again. Now you can see the background is transparent by default, and if I type leader bg, the background reappears, and if I type leader bg again, it's going to be transparent again. Let's also move Neotree to a specific module. So let's open Neotree again, go into the plugins directory and create a neotree.lua file, open it up, and again we have the same pattern. So we basically need to return a Lua table, and inside of this table we can put our config. So we already have a config in the init.lua file, but this is pretty limited. I just chose the basic configuration from the README, but there's a more advanced configuration which I like to use. So let's go back into the browser. And if we scroll down a bit here, you can see a longer example for Packer. Now Packer is a different package manager, but we can easily convert the setup code from Packer to lazy. Let's actually copy this here, go back into our configuration file, and paste the entire configuration. Now we need to delete this use keyword, and let's also go back to the bottom of the file and remove the closing curly brace, since we already created one from the Lua table that we return. Let's go back to the top. And another difference from Packer is that dependencies need to be specified under the dependencies property instead of the requires property. At the bottom of the file, we can add some additional keymaps. I like to add the following keymap, which allows us to toggle Neotree with leader E. So leader E will open it and leader E again will close it. Let's save this configuration, exit out of Neovim, and see if it works. Alright, that's looking good. We see the lazy UI again, and we can see that the NVim window picker got installed, which is one of the dependencies of the new Neotree config. Let's press Q. And let's try to open Neotree with leader E. And it works. And if we press leader E again, it will be closed. Leader E will open it. That's pretty nice. Now I didn't comment on the different configuration options that you have in Neotree. There are lots of them. And what I like about this configuration that we just copied is that it has pretty much all of the different options that are available. So if you want to change anything, feel free to go through it and configure it to your liking. I prefer to have all of these options available so that if I want to change something, I don't need to look for it in the documentation. I can just go to my configuration file straight away. For now, I'm pretty happy with how it works. If you have any doubts about how to use Neotree, you can also go into the Neotree buffer and press question mark, and this will show you all of the different shortcuts that are available in Neotree. Alright, now let's add a sleek buffer line to our config so that we can always see which files we are currently working in. Let's go back into Neotree and under plugins, create another module for Bufferline. Let me actually add my config first and apply it so that you can see how it looks, and then I think it will be easier to understand once I walk you through it. So this is my full config. Let's save it. Again, let's go into the init.lua file. We need to go down to line 15 and require from plugins Bufferline. And don't forget to add the comma here. Let's save and quit. And let's open Neovim up again. Now we can see that Bufferline got installed. Now I'll open Bufferline again. And now let's walk through the config step by step. Now, of course, here the second line specifies the repo where we find the Bufferline plugin. And we have a couple of dependencies which are also Git repos, and they essentially ensure that we have nice icons available. Then, as I mentioned previously, we have the config property of lazy, and this takes a function. This function will be executed every time this plugin is loaded. And this executes the Bufferline Setup method. And in this setup method, we can pass a couple of options. So we pass in the mode option, which says that we want to see buffers instead of tabs. It should be themable, so it should adjust to the theme that we have set. We don't want to see any numbers on the buffer, so I personally prefer to keep them rather clean. When we close a buffer, the bdelete command is executed. We specified a close buffer icon, and this is the X you see in the buffer line next to the file name. There's also another close icon for the entire tab if we have multiple tabs, but I wanted it to be the same icon. Path components equal to 1 means that we just want to see the file name and not the entire file path. We have a modified icon, so if we do some modifications, so for example, if I add a line here, then you can see the modified icon that I specified here. So now it's the green dot in the Bufferline tab. If I undo this, it will disappear. If we have many different buffers open, then they will be truncated and we see these icons. We want to limit the number of characters that are going to be displayed and also the size of the tabs, not to be too wide or too narrow. I don't like to see any diagnostics in the buffer line. I prefer to keep it rather clean. I like to see icons of the files in the buffer line and I like to see them in color. If there's a custom order of the buffers, I like it to be persisted. Separator style specifies the separator between the buffers. Enforce regular tabs ensures that all tabs have the same size. Always show buffer line, as the name suggests. We always want to see the buffer line. I want to hide Vim tab indicators, and I don't like to see any indicators on the buffers themselves. I like to keep it rather clean, and I just want to see the name of the file highlighted, and that's it. You can also pin buffers, and then this will be the icon for it, and there are a couple of padding options. And if a new buffer is opened, it will be inserted at the end. Then we have a highlights section here, and this basically allows us to set different colors for different highlighting elements in the buffer line. So here, for example, the separator, which is the line that separates the buffers. I set the foreground color here to a gray from the Nord color theme. When a buffer is selected, as I mentioned, I want the file name to be bold and not italic. And then there are a couple of other things that you could configure, like the separator for the selected buffer, a background, a fill, but I didn't touch them for this case, but still I prefer to keep them as comments just in case. So I hope this makes sense. And another thing that I would like to mention is that in Keymaps, we previously configured that using tab and shift tab, we can switch to the next and previous buffers. Now we can actually see this in action. So if I press tab, then you can see that I can move between the buffers, and with shift tab I can go back. Another thing that could really improve our config at this point, in my opinion, is a much nicer status line. The status line is what you see here at the bottom, which currently just shows the file path and the location in the file that we're currently in. There's a really nice plugin called Lureline, which allows us to configure this in detail. So let's add this next. Using tab, I go back into the init.lua file, and here I require another module that we are going to create called plugins Lureline. And again, don't forget the comma here. Let's open up NeoTree again and press A and create the Lureline module. Let's open it. And again, let me add my entire config, save it, close Neovim, go back into Neovim. Lureline is going to be installed. Let's open Neovim again and go to the Lureline module again. And now we can see that we have a really nice status line that shows the current mode that we are in. So normal mode or insert mode, or if we go into visual mode, it will indicate this. Then we see the file name. If we were in a Git branch, this would also be indicated. On the right side, we see the file encoding. We see the file type, the current location that we're in the file. So now we are in line 1 on character 1. So if we move a couple of characters, you will see this. And if we move down a couple of lines, this will also be shown. And then lastly, we see at what percentage of the file in terms of lines we are. So if we go to the bottom, we see bot. And if we go one line up, we can see we're at 98%. And at the top, we are on top. And then if we go down a bit, you see the percentage increasing. Now, how does this configuration work? Let's have a look at the Lureline repository. If we scroll down a bit here, we find the default configuration. And again, we need to require Lureline and call the setup method. And here we have a couple of properties. The main ones are options, sections, and inactive sections. Options are kind of the global settings. So do we want to have icons enabled? What is the theme that Lualign should have? And what are the separators that we want to see between the different sections? These kind of things. Under sections, we configure the different sections themselves. So you can see Lualign A, B, C and X, Y, Z. A, B, C are the sections that are on the left-hand side, and X, Y, Z are the sections that are going to be on the right-hand side. So by default, we have in A the mode. This is the current mode that we are in, insert mode, visual mode, and so on. Next to that, we have the branch, then the git diff, and any diagnostics. And next to that, we have the file name. All of these sections are, of course, divided by the section separators that can be set in the global options. And then on the right-hand side, we have the file encoding, the file format, file type, progress, and the location, as I showed you earlier. So we didn't deviate that much from the defaults. I think they're quite sensible. To each of these components, we can also pass additional options, which I'll show you in a bit. Inactive sections, it's basically the same thing, but it is what Lualign will show in Vim splits that are currently not active. So with that in mind, let's have a look at my config in detail. So as we've just seen, the different Lualign sections can have components like mode, file type, and so on. And to these components, we can pass different arguments. For example, I define a variable here for the mode component, and I make use of the format argument. To this format argument, I pass a function that takes one argument, which is a string, and then it just returns the string. But actually it appends the Vim logo in front of the string. The dot dot in Lua is a string concatenation. It will basically take the Vim logo and then append the string. And the string in this case is the Vim mode. If you just want to see the first character of the mode, like N for normal mode and V for visual mode, you could instead uncomment this line. Now for the file name component, I like to set the file status to true, so this allows us to see if the file has been modified, and I set the path to 0. So 0 means we just see the file name. If we set it to 1, we see the relative file path, and 2 would mean the absolute file path. Then there are a couple of components that I don't always want to see. Diagnostics, for example. If there are no diagnostics currently in the file, I don't want to see a 0 in the Lua line, and also if the window is too small, I would prefer to hide the diagnostics because space in the Lua line is limited. So for this purpose, I define this function, hide in width. If the window width is more than 100 characters, it will return true. If not, it will return false. So this allows us to set in the diagnostics this condition where we pass the function, and this will basically only show the diagnostics if this condition is true. So that means if we have a window width of more than 100 characters, diagnostics will be shown, and if it's less, the condition is not met, and then diagnostics will be hidden. Also, I set the always visible property to false, which means that diagnostics will be hidden by default. Another section that I want to configure is the diff. This will show any git diffs to the file. So basically, if we have added lines, it will show this plus icon. If it's modified, this dot. And if we have removed lines, it will show this subtraction symbol. And also, we don't always want to see this. We only want to see this if there's enough space. So having set these variables, we can go into the Lualign Setup method. And here we pass the main options that we have just seen. I want to have icons, the theme should be naught, and then I have a couple of custom separators. So the main sections are separated using these triangles. I found these icons on this website, nerdfonts.com/cheat sheet. And here in the comment, I added a couple of alternative separators that you could use. So instead of these triangles, you could also use kind of an arrow shape or have like rounded separators. I really like these triangle separators. On the left-hand side, we have this triangle pointing to the upper left, kind of. And on the right-hand side, we have this triangle pointing to the lower right. And then the different components are separated using these forward slashes. We also disable Lualign on certain file types. Alpha is also something that we will see, and Neotree. So if we open Neotree, for example, you don't see a Lualign in this buffer, which I prefer. Alright, now let's go into the different sections. So in Lualign A we have mode, and instead of a string I pass the variable that I defined earlier with all the format options. Then we have branch, which I leave as default, the file type, and then on the right hand side we have the diagnostics and diff, which we configured earlier. Then we have the file encoding, and here we pass one more additional option. I also only want to see the encoding when there's enough space, so I pass the hide in width function, and the same for the file type. Then in the Y segment we have the location, and on the very right we have the progress. In the inactive sections, I like to see the relative file path and the location. Finally, we want to add the fugitive extension. This is currently not installed, but we will do that later. And this will allow Lualign to keep track of the git diff and show the appropriate symbols when there are changes in the file. And that's really about it. Now we have a super nice status line configured that displays loads of useful information. The next plugin I would like to add to our config is called Treesitter. Treesitter is a parsing library that generates syntax trees. And those syntax trees can help Neovim understand the code structure better. And this enables advanced features like find references, go to definition, and generally improves our syntax highlighting. To demonstrate how Treesitter improves syntax highlighting, let me create a Terraform file here. So let's call this main.tf and paste some Terraform configuration. So this would create a small server in AWS. And as you can see now, the syntax highlighting is pretty sparse. A lot of important keywords like Terraform here or required providers and stuff like that is all white. Let's see how this changes once we have Treesitter installed. To get a nice Treesitter config, let's go back to the Kickstart project and search for Treesitter. And I think this refers to something else. So let's go to the next reference here. All right, so this is the Treesitter config that is provided by Kickstart. Let's highlight everything here, copy it, go back into our own config and create a new plugin module for Treesitter under the plugins directory. Let's paste the config here. And of course, we always need to remember to return it. And let's remove the comma here. And this should be pretty much all we need. As you can see, there are a couple of sources that Treesitter installs here. So we have a parser for Bash, for C, for div, HTML, Lua, LuaDoc, Markdown, and so on. Now we have a pretty long line here that we can't fully read. So let's make use of the keymap that we set up earlier, leader LW. And now we can see all of the sources that have been set up. This is a good starting point, but I like to add a few more languages. So let me replace this property with all the languages that I use. So now we have Lua, Python, JavaScript, TypeScript, also regex, Terraform, SQL, Dockerfile, also JSON, Java, Groovy, and a couple of other file types. Let's save this and exit out of Vim, restart Vim. Okay, now we forgot to add Treesitter to the setup list. Let's require it now. Save, quit, restart Vim again. Now Treesitter will be installed. And this should be it. Let's restart Vim one more time. And now let's check again our Terraform file that we created earlier. As you can see, now the important keywords are highlighted properly. We see Terraform is now in dark blue, the required providers, provider, resource, everything that used to be white is now properly highlighted. The next plugin I would like to add is called Telescope. Telescope is a super powerful and amazing fuzzy finder that allows us to find stuff in our code base. I have not seen a Neovim config yet that doesn't have Telescope installed, so it's something that we should definitely get set up. Fortunately, Kickstart.nvim provides a really nice configuration. So let's go there and search for Telescope. And here it is. Let's also copy this entire configuration, go back to our configuration, again, as we did before, create the Telescope module and paste the configuration here. And we want to return a Lua table. All right, that's looking good. Let's go into our init Lua file before we forget. And here we want to require from plugins the Telescope module. Save. Of course, remove the Terraform file. We don't need it anymore. Let's actually close Neovim, restart it. This will install Telescope. And now we can actually use Telescope to navigate back into our Telescope configuration file. With leader SF, we can fuzzy find files. And here I can search Tele. This will highlight the Telescope configuration file. And we see a preview on the right-hand side. And with Control U and Control D, I can scroll through that preview. Now I can press Enter to confirm the selection, and it brings me to the configuration file. I don't want to go into all of the details of this Telescope configuration. The comments here are really descriptive and they do a really good job at explaining it. Instead, I want to focus on the things that I would change here. So let's scroll down a little bit under the setup function. There's a section where we can override the default mappings and pickers. So let's paste my config here. Under defaults here, we can add a few additional key maps. So I like to have Control K and Control J to go up and down the Telescope menu. And I would like to be able to open the selected file with Control L. So this is how you would set this up. Under pickers, we can set file ignore patterns. So if we run the find files command, we want to ignore node modules, the .git directory, and the .venv directory, which is for Python virtual environment. But what I do want to see is hidden files like .env files and other things that would normally not be included in the Telescope module. I also want to make the same changes for the live grab command. So live grab can be triggered with leader SG, and now instead of searching for files, we can search for substrings. So let's search for Keymaps, for example, and now this will display all the different files that contain the word keymap. And here the same, I would like to exclude node modules, Git and Vn from this selection, but I would like to include hidden files, and this is how we could set this up. If we scroll down a bit further, you can see all the keymaps that have been set up by Kickstart. I'm really happy with these and I don't feel like changing them. To give you a few more examples of what we can do, with leader we can search for the open buffers. Leader SW will search for the word that's currently under the cursor, so now we are looking for all the files that contain the word Vim. Leader SH will search through help tags, and I would really encourage you to try out the other options as well. Now let's move on to configure LSP. LSP stands for Language Server Protocol, and it is what allows us to jump to the definition of a function, for example, across files. It gives us really smart autocompletion, hover information, and so much more. This image here from the VS Code documentation shows how it works. On one side we have the developer tool, so it could be a VS Code, it could also be Neovim or something else. And on the other side we have language servers. And there are language specific servers for Python, JavaScript, TypeScript, even JSON and all the other languages. Now if in our developer tool we perform an action, like we enter a file or we make an edit to a file, or we request to go to a definition, then a request is sent to the language server. And the language server has analyzed our files and sends an appropriate response. So for example, if we make an edit to a file and there's a problem with it, the language server might respond with a warning. Or if you want to go to the definition of a function, the language server might respond with a URI for that definition so that our developer tool or Neovim knows which file to open. Setting up LSP inside of Neovim is not straightforward, unfortunately. I tried to do it myself in the past and I got it to work, but my config was quite unstable, and when there were updates, the LSP would frequently break and I found myself debugging a lot of things and spent a lot of time just getting this to work. Fortunately, LSP in Neovim is a solved problem and we're not the first ones to ever set this up. I would say probably most people that use Neovim also use the LSP integration. To avoid reinventing the wheel and save ourselves a lot of hassle, let's borrow the LSP configuration from Kickstart. Let's navigate back to the Kickstart repository and search for main LSP. This will bring us to the LSP section. Let's again copy the whole thing, navigate back to our own project, open up new tree, go to plugins and create a module for LSP. Open this up, paste the config, return a Lua table, get rid of the comma at the end. Go back to the top, and now let's have a look at this file. So what are all of these plugins? The first plugin is called NVim LSP config, and this comes directly from Neovim. This plugin allows us to configure the LSP features. Now we have a couple of dependencies. We have Mason. Mason is a tool that allows us to install the different LSP servers directly in Neovim. Mason LSP config basically bridges the gap between Mason and Neovim LSP config. It allows us to automate the setup process of the different language servers. Let's scroll down a bit and you can see there's a lot of comments again in this file. What is LSP, and it explains also the different features that are available in LSP, like go to definition, find references, autocompletion, and so much more. And I would really encourage you to read through all of the comments because they explain the concepts really well, and I personally have learned a lot from it. Let's scroll down a bit more. Here we can see a couple of keybinds that have been set up. GD, for example, will take us to the definition of whatever we are on with the cursor. GR to find references, and there are a lot more keymaps. Another really useful one is leader RN. This allows you to rename an object across the entire code base, which is super useful. Let's scroll down a bit further until we get to the servers section. So this is the most important part. Here we can add the different LSP servers that we want to configure. For example, now we currently have the Lua LS language server already set up. But if we wanted to have a TypeScript server, we could also uncomment this, and this will include the TypeScript LSP server with the default configuration. This is completely fine for me because I don't usually work with TypeScript, but let me add a few language servers that I do use on a daily basis. So let me add them here. The first tool that I would like to add is called Rough. Rough is a Python linter and formatter. It checks our code for any style issues or errors, and it can also automatically fix certain problems. Unfortunately, rough is not a fully fledged LSP. It is more meant to be a linter in the current file that you're working in. It does not provide things like go to references or go to definition. For this we need another tool, which is called PyLSP. PyLSP comes with a lot of plugins out of the box, but since we have rough and we want rough to take care of most of this, we can disable pretty much all of them. We just need PyLSP for things like go to definition, and we don't want it to interfere with rough. I want to add a few more language servers for languages that I use quite frequently. So here we have HTML and CSS, Tailwind, we have a language server for Docker, SQL, Terraform, JSON, and YAML. For me, the default configuration is fine here for the most part. I think that is all we need to set up for LSP right now. Let's actually save this file, quit Neovim, and reopen it. Again, I forgot to add the module here. So again, let's require it from plugins, LSP, save and quit, and reopen Vim again. Now the LSP will get installed. And now you can see that all the language servers are being installed as well. So this is what Mason is doing. Once you see that no more language servers are installing, let's reopen Neovim one more time. And now we can see that the LSP is working. So as you can see, we get a lot of diagnostic warnings, which show us that the Vim variable doesn't seem to be defined. I think this is a bit of a configuration issue on our side. So let's open up again the LSP configuration file and go back down to the Lua ls configuration. And here we want to add the following settings. This will tell Lua ls where to find the Lua files loaded in our Neovim configuration. So let's save this again. Close Neovim, go back into Neovim, wait for the LSP to load, and we can see this in the bottom right here. This is the fidget plugin working, and now we only get one more diagnostic warning, which is that we have a trailing space in this line here. So if we remove this, the LSP will notice this and also clear up the warning. Now to demonstrate one of the LSP features, let's save this file, go down 4 lines, navigate to NeoTree, and here let's press GD to go to the NeoTree definition. And as expected, it opened up the NeoTree configuration file. Now we do see a couple more warnings here, but we don't necessarily need to worry about all of them. Another feature of the LSP is hover information. So if we go back into our init file and we want to see, for example, what this prepend does, then we can press Shift-K to view the docstring of this method. Another feature that is closely linked to LSP is autocompletion. So let's set this up next. Using leader E, I'm gonna open up NeoTree again, and under plugins, I will create an autocompletion module. Now we're getting this error, and this is because the LSP is missing the CMP package. Don't worry about this, this is something we're gonna add now. So I'll just press enter to get it out of the way. And now let's create the autocompletion.lua module. And again, autocompletion is not something that is super straightforward to set up. So let's go to Kickstart again and check if we can find something on autocompletion. And here is the autocompletion configuration from Kickstart. Let's go back into our module, paste it here. Again, we have the error because CMP is not installed yet. That's not a problem for now. Let's just press enter. Return this Lua table, remove the comma at the end. And for now, let's just save and close and restart Neovim so that this can install. We still need to add it to our setup method. Save, restart Neovim. Now autocompletion is installing. Alright, a couple more plugins installed. And using Telescope, let's go into our autocompletion configuration. And as you can see, we didn't get the error anymore. Let's make a few modifications to this config. The event is set to insert enter, so this should load the plugin whenever we enter insert mode. But for me, this didn't work really well, so I get rid of it. And let's also uncomment friendly snippets, which will give us access to a bunch of snippets in different languages that we can use. So let's again save this, restart Neovim. This will install as expected friendly snippets. And now if I start typing something, the auto suggestions will pop up, and with Control N I can navigate down, and with Control P I can navigate up. Personally, I don't really like how this is displayed right now. I think it could make use of icons a lot more. It would look much nicer. And also, instead of using N and P to navigate up and down, I would like to use Tab and Shift Tab, which I find more intuitive. So let's set this up now. Again, let's open up the autocompletion configuration. Here let's scroll down a bit until we see the mappings section. Let's scroll to the bottom of it. Here I want to add the following snippets. Let me explain. If the autocompletions are visible, then we will simply select the next item. But if we are inside a snippet, then we will jump through the different segments of the snippet. And with Shift Tab, we will do the same thing, but in reverse. I will demonstrate this in a bit, but let's add a few more configuration options here by scrolling up a bit. And here I would like to add a Lua table that contains simply key value pairs of the different types of auto suggestions and an icon for each one of them. So that's all we did here. And now let's scroll down to the bottom again. And here under sources, I would like to add some formatting options that you can see now. Let's also indent them properly. So what we're doing here is applying formatting to the autocompletion menu. And we're using the kind icons table that we defined earlier with the key value pairs to reformat each of the items in the suggestions. All right, let's save this, close Neovim, restart Neovim. Now if I start typing something, I get auto suggestions. I first see an icon indicating the type of auto suggestion, and in green on the right side, we can see where the suggestion is coming from. So for example, is it coming from the LSP or is it a snippet? Now if I start typing if, I can see that a snippet is suggested. Now I can select the snippet with Control Y, and then I can just start typing. So for example, 1 equals 1, and now I can use Tab to jump to the body of the if statement, and here I can say, I don't know, x equals y or something like that. And this is how snippets work. Let's undo these changes. We don't really want to mess with our init file. If you want to add more language servers to support LSP functionalities or autocompletion, you can install them with Mason, as I mentioned earlier. So for this, we have to go into command mode with colon and then type Mason with a capital N. And here we can see all the different LSPs that are currently installed. So those are the ones that we set up in the LSP configuration module. You could also install them directly from the Mason UI that we see now, but I would always recommend to install the LSPs through code since this is more maintainable. Now let's move on to setting up auto-formatting. When I say auto-formatting, I mean that my files should be formatted on save to keep them nice and clean. This can be achieved with a plugin called NoneLS, which was formerly known as NullLS. This tool allows us to set up non-LSP sources like formatters and use them inside of Neovim as though they were LSPs. To set this up in our config, let's create a new module using Neotree for auto-formatting. And we also need to remember, of course, to require it in our init file. And now we can open this file. And here I will paste my configuration. Okay, so now what does all of this do? We have the NoneLS plugin and also the NoneLS extras. This will give us access to some additional sources that are not included in the base package. And then again we have Mason, which will allow us to install the different tools. The tools that I would like to install are Prettier to format TypeScript and JavaScript, StyleLua for Lua, ESLint for linting TypeScript and JavaScript, shformat, which is a formatter for shell scripts, checkmate, which is a linter for makefiles, and finally the most important one for me, rough, which is a Python linter and formatter. Here I want to use it for its formatting capabilities. Then under sources, we can configure how these different tools behave. For example, I want to use Prettier only on these file types, and I'm passing some additional arguments to rough. This will enable the automatic formatting of imports in Python files. Finally, the snippet you see here is something I found in the documentation, and this actually sets up the auto formatting. So let's save this, quit Neovim, restart Neovim, and now all the tools and plugins got installed. Let's demonstrate the auto formatting capabilities on this file. This file actually has a couple of format issues. For example, here we have 2 spaces for indentation, and here we use 4 spaces for indentation. So let's just save this file and see what happens. Now as you can see, everything got indented with 4 spaces and all the single quotes got replaced with double quotes. Now in Lua, I personally prefer 2 spaces indentation instead of 4. We can configure the behavior of the StyleLua formatter by creating a .stylelua toml file in the root directory of our configuration. If we open this and paste my configuration here, we save, we exit out of Neovim, open again, and if we save this file again, you will see that the new formatting guidelines got applied. Now let's add another plugin called Git Signs. Git Signs is a Git integration for your buffers. It gives you the ability to see which lines have been changed. You can also jump between hunks, you can stage changes and much more. To set up Git Signs, let's require a new module that we are going to create called Git Signs. And let's create this module now under Plugins. Here I will paste my own configuration. I'm not configuring much at all here. I'm just defining the symbols used in the gutter to show which lines have been changed. So let me save this, exit out of Neovim, re-enter. Now we don't see anything because our configuration is not a Git repository. But if we make it a Git repository with git init, and then we go back into Neovim, now we see that Lua line is indicating that we are on the main branch. And if I make some changes, or I add some new lines, Git Signs will show the changes with an icon on each line that was changed. Next, let's add a nice greeting screen with the Alpha plugin. This plugin will show up every time you start Neovim, and it will display some character art like here and your most recently used files, so that you can easily open them up again. Let's require one more module here called Alpha. And now using Neotree, let's create that module, open it up. The configuration is pretty straightforward. All that I'm changing here is the ASCII art that is being displayed on the greeting screen. I found this Neovim ASCII art on this GitHub. It has some really nice Neovim ASCII art that you could use for your welcome screen. Again, let's quit and restart Neovim. The plugin got installed, so let's quit Neovim, and now let's start Neovim again. But this time let's not directly enter into the init file, let's just run Neovim. And now we are greeted with this beautiful Neovim starting screen. Here we can see the files that we have recently opened. We can open the init file by pressing 0. Now let's move on to add a plugin called Indent Line. This plugin gives us vertical lines to indicate the current indentation level, which makes the code overall a bit more readable. So again, let's require the module Indent Line, save. Now let's actually create this module, and I will add my configuration. The configuration is also pretty straightforward. You can indicate the character that you want for the vertical line, and also you can set up certain file types where you do not want it to be displayed. Let's open Neovim again. This will install Indent Line. Now we are greeted again with our Neovim starting screen, and if we open a file, for example the telescope configuration, let's quickly apply Autoformatting by saving it. And now you can see we have these vertical lines to show the current indentation level, which makes everything just a bit more readable. Awesome, so now we are almost done configuring plugins. I just want to add a few more miscellaneous plugins. Let's add them now. For the miscellaneous plugins, let's create a new module called misc.lua, and here I will paste my configuration. In this module, I include standalone plugins that require less than 10 lines of configuration. The first plugin I have here, the Vim Tmux Navigator, is super essential for my workflow. This allows me to seamlessly navigate between Vim and Tmux splits. So for example, if I have a Tmux split here to the right, I can jump between Neovim and Tmux in the same way that I navigate between splits in Neovim, using Control and HJKL. The next plugin automatically detects and adjusts buffer options like tab stop and shift width. Then we have Fugitive and Rhubarb. Those two take our Git integration to the next level. They allow us to run Git commands directly from Neovim. For example, I can now run the git diff command, and this will give me a git diff directly in a new split, which can be super useful. WhичKey is another super useful plugin. During the process of configuring Neovim, we have set up a lot of different keybinds, and probably we can't remember all of them. What WhичKey does is hint to you the keybinds that are available. For example, if I type space, then this window will pop up, which shows me the next keys that I could press. For example, S, and then from here, it shows me all the key combinations that have leader S. And now if I press F, then as we know, this opens up Telescope. So incredibly useful. NVim auto-pairs, as the name suggests, it auto-closes parentheses, brackets and quotes, which is also really nice to have. Then we have to-do comments. This highlights certain comments. For example, if I have a to-do comment here, then as you can see, this will get highlighted in a special way so they're more easily visible. The last plugin on the list is NVim Colorizer. This is super useful if you're doing anything with colors. This automatically detects colors in your code and highlights those. For example, let's make up some color. And as you can see, the plugin will automatically highlight it in the corresponding color. And that's really about it. If you stuck around until now, thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you found this valuable at all, please consider liking and subscribing, it really does help the channel, and I will create a Git repository with this entire configuration and leave a link to it in the description box down below for your reference. Thanks again and see you next time, bye.